The research station floated in the darkness of space, its lights blinking against the void. Inside, Dr. Vexler stared at the creature in the containment field. He had been studying it for 30 years, just like his father before him. And his father's father before that. The creature floated there, silent and still, watching him with its enormous eye. The eye was the strangest part. It took up most of the creature's round body. A massive organ that seemed to follow movement even though the scientists could find no muscles to explain how. The creature had no mouth, no legs, no wings, nothing that made sense. It just existed, floating and watching with that unblinking stare. 400 years. That was how long the Galactic Council had been studying these things. They had found them on a dead world called Kelrath Prime, sealed inside chambers that kept them perfectly preserved. Whoever built those chambers was long gone, vanished into history without leaving any clues about why these creatures mattered so much. Vexillar touched the control panel, bringing up layer after layer of research data, cellular scans, neural mappings, chemical analyses, behavioral studies. Generations of scientists had examined every aspect of these creatures, and still nobody understood what they were or where they came from. They defied all known biology. They had no digestive system, yet they survived. They had something that looked like nerves, but arranged in patterns unlike any living thing in the galaxy. Commander Lysara had visited the station last month, bringing samples from her latest expedition to Kelrath Prime. She had been searching the ruins for any hint about the creatures, any piece of information that might finally solve the mystery. But like all the expeditions before hers, she found nothing useful. Just more empty buildings and more questions. The creatures tracked her team with their eyes during the whole visit. That was what they did. They watched. Scientists had spent years trying to determine if this meant intelligence or just basic light response. The eyes were too complex for simple photoreceptors. They could see wavelengths of light that most species couldn't even detect. But the creatures never communicated, never showed any sign of thought beyond that steady, unnerving gaze. Vexler heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the new researchers approaching. Humans. The Galactic Council had accepted humanity just 2 years ago, and now they were everywhere, eager and curious about everything. These two had been assigned to his team last week, Dr. Peter Walsh and Dr. Lisa Bennett, both xenobiologists from Earth. Peter was tall and thin, with brown hair that never seemed to stay in place. Lisa was shorter, with dark skin and bright eyes that took in everything around her. They had spent their first few days reviewing old research files, barely speaking to anyone. Vexlar found it a bit odd, but humans were still new to galactic society. Perhaps they needed time to adjust. Peter stopped in front of the containment field, staring at the creature inside. His face went through several expressions that Vexillar couldn't quite read. Humans were hard to understand sometimes. Their faces moved in ways that didn't match any species Vexillar knew. Lisa joined Peter, looking at the creature, then at Peter, then back at the creature. Her eyes got wider. She made a sound, something between a cough and a laugh, and covered her mouth with her hand. Vexillar's scales shifted color slightly, showing his confusion. He asked if something was wrong. The translator built into his collar converted his words into English for the humans to understand. Peter turned to look at him. The human's expression was strange, like he didn't know whether to smile or frown. He asked Vexillar a question that made no sense. He wanted to know if the research team had ever consulted with agricultural experts. Agricultural experts? Vexillar repeated the words, making sure his translator had worked correctly. Why would they need farmers to study a creature? These were xenobiologists, geneticists, neural specialists. The greatest scientific minds in the galaxy had examined these specimens. What could farmers possibly add? Lisa was shaking now, her shoulders moving up and down. She turned away from the containment field, and Vexillar could hear sounds coming from her that the translator labeled as laughter. But why would she be laughing? There was nothing funny about a 400-year-old mystery that had stumped the entire galactic scientific community. Peter pulled out a small device, what humans called a tablet. He touched the screen a few times, then showed it to Vexillar. The image on the screen showed something round and layered, with papery skin covering the outside. The label on the image said one word in human language and several more in translation. Vexillar read it slowly. Onion, allium cepa, edible bulb, vegetable. He looked at the image, then at the creature in the containment field, then back at the image. His scales went through several colors as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. The similarity was remarkable. The round shape, the layered structure, even the papery outer covering that some specimens had. But that was impossible. These were creatures, living organisms found in sophisticated stasis chambers built by an advanced civilization. Peter started explaining in simple terms. On Earth, he said, onions were plants, not creatures or animals, but vegetables that humans grew in the ground and ate in their food. They had been cultivating onions for thousands of years. Every human knew what an onion looked like because they saw them almost every day in markets and kitchens. Vexlar felt something cold spreading through his body. He brought up the cellular scans on the main display, the ones that showed the creature's internal structure. The layers, the cell patterns, the chemical composition. Peter pulled up comparison data from Earth's agricultural database. The patterns matched. Everything matched. Lisa had stopped laughing and was now looking at the creature with a mixture of amazement and sympathy. She explained that what they had been calling a nervous system was probably just the vascular tissue that carried water and nutrients through the plant. The eye wasn't an eye at all, but the base where the onion had been cut from its roots when harvested. Other researchers in the lab had noticed the commotion and were gathering around. Vexlar could feel their attention on him, waiting for him to say something. His mind raced through 30 years of research, his father's research, hundreds of papers published across the galaxy, all based on the assumption that these were unknown creatures. He asked the question quietly, barely trusting his translator to carry the words. The humans were saying that the galaxy had spent 400 years studying a vegetable, something that humans cut up and put in their meals. Peter nodded slowly. He looked almost apologetic as he confirmed it. Yes, these were onions. Common cooking ingredients on Earth. Nothing mysterious about them at all once you knew what you were looking at. The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of equipment. Somewhere in that silence, everything the galaxy thought it knew about the specimens from Kelrath Prime collapsed into a new and much simpler truth. The creatures weren't creatures at all. They were groceries. The conference room was packed with scientists from every corner of the galaxy. Word had spread fast about the human discovery, and now everyone wanted to hear what Peter and Lisa had to say. Vexlar sat in the front row, his scales still showing traces of the shock he had felt 3 days ago. Next to him, Commander Lesara tapped her clawed fingers on the table, her face unreadable. Chief Archivist Kelthos had flown in from the Mordian homeworld specifically for this meeting. He was old, even by Mordian standards, and had personally overseen research on the eyeball creatures for over a century. The look he gave the two humans was not friendly. Peter stood at the front of the room, surprisingly calm for someone about to tell the galaxy's top scientists that they had been wrong for 400 years. Lisa stood beside him, a tablet in her hands displaying the evidence they had gathered over the past few days. The holographic display activated, showing the familiar image of an eyeball creature floating in its containment field. Peter started talking, his voice steady and clear. He thanked everyone for coming, and acknowledged the incredible amount of work that had gone into studying these specimens over the centuries. He spoke with respect, making it clear he wasn't there to mock anyone. Then he changed the display. Next to the eyeball creature, he placed an image of an onion cut in half. The two images sat side by side, and the resemblance was impossible to ignore. The room erupted in noise. Different species made different sounds when they were upset, and all of them were happening at once. Lysara stood up, demanding to know if this was some kind of human joke. Kelthos accessed the Earth databases himself, his old fingers moving quickly across his own tablet, cross-referencing images and data. Lisa waited for the noise to die down, then began her presentation. She explained what an onion was in simple terms. A plant bulb, she said, made of layers of modified leaves wrapped around each other. Humans had been growing them for food since ancient times. They were in almost every human culture, used in cooking across the entire planet. She brought up detailed comparisons. The cellular structure that scientists had documented matched perfectly with plant cells. The supposed nervous system was vascular tissue, tubes that carried water and nutrients. The layers that researchers thought were some kind of protective adaptation were just the natural structure of how onions grew. Peter took over, addressing the biggest question. What about the eye? That enormous organ that everyone had focused on for centuries? He explained that it wasn't an eye at all. When farmers harvested onions, they cut them from the roots. What looked like an eye was just the base of the plant, the spot where roots had once connected to the bulb. A scientist from the Valorian species stood up, asking about the tracking behavior. Everyone had seen how the creatures seemed to follow movement with their gaze. "How did a vegetable do that?" Lisa answered patiently. It didn't. The apparent tracking was an illusion caused by people expecting to see it. The round shape and central mark created a pattern that brains interpreted as an eye watching them. Add in slight movements from air currents in the containment fields, and confirmation bias did the rest. Researchers saw what they expected to see, an intelligent creature watching them back. Gary Thompson appeared on the holographic display, calling in from Earth. He was an agricultural specialist who had worked with onions his entire career. He showed different varieties: red onions, white onions, yellow onions, sweet onions. Each one looked slightly different, but all had the same basic structure. Some of the variations matched different specimens that had been cataloged across various research stations. The Zenthari research team had already begun running new tests based on the human information. Vexlar stood up and confirmed what his team had found. The chemical composition matched plant biology. The sulfur compounds that gave onions their strong smell were present in the samples. The energy signature that had seemed so mysterious was just stored sugars, food that the plant had saved for growth. Keltho sat very still, processing this information. Finally, he asked the question everyone was thinking. Why would an advanced civilization preserve vegetables in elaborate stasis chambers? What possible reason could the Kelrath have had? Peter switched the display to show images from human history. Seed vaults buried in Arctic ice storing plant samples in case of global disaster. Agricultural museums preserving heirloom varieties of crops. Ancient grain storage facilities found in archaeological sites. He explained that many civilizations treated food preservation as a sacred duty. Lisa added more context. Famines had shaped human history. Crop failures had destroyed civilizations. The knowledge of how to grow food, and the seeds to do it, were often considered the most valuable things a society could possess. More valuable than gold, than weapons, than any technology. Perhaps the Kelrath had faced something similar. Maybe their onion crops had failed, and these specimens were the last ones, preserved in hope of future restoration. Or maybe onions held cultural significance beyond just food. Humans had foods that carried deep meaning. Bread in some cultures, rice in others. Without more information about the Kelrath, they could only guess. But the facts were clear. The galaxy had spent 400 years and countless resources studying what humans would simply chop up for dinner. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Then, surprisingly, Vexlar started making a sound. It took a moment for the humans to realize he was laughing, or at least making the Zenthari version of it. His scales flashed through a rainbow of colors as he stood up and walked to the front of the room. He looked at Peter and Lisa, then at the images on display, then back at the assembled scientists. He said something that the translators had trouble processing at first, then rendered as a simple statement. They had all been incredibly foolish, but at least now they knew the truth. Kelthos joined him, his ancient face showing what might have been a smile. He acknowledged that this was probably the most expensive mistake in galactic scientific history. But mistakes, he said, were how knowledge advanced. The important thing was learning from them. Commander Lissara was already making plans. If the Kelrath had preserved onions, what else might be hidden in those ruins? The previous expeditions had focused on the stasis chambers and ignored everything else. Now, with human help, they could search for evidence of agriculture, cooking, food culture, everything they had missed. Peter suggested they needed a new expedition to Kelrath Prime, one that included agricultural experts and anthropologists who understood food culture. Lisa agreed, adding that they should look at the entire site with fresh eyes, without assuming they knew what anything was. The meeting continued for hours as scientists from different species asked questions and shared ideas. Some were embarrassed, others fascinated, all of them eager to understand how such a fundamental error had persisted for so long. The humans remained patient, explaining Earth agriculture and plant biology to beings who had never encountered anything quite like it. By the end of the meeting, plans were in motion for a comprehensive new study of the Kelrath ruins. Teams were being assembled, combining alien expertise with human knowledge. The onions that had been mysterious creatures just days ago were now teaching tools, examples of how easy it was to misunderstand the unfamiliar. As the room emptied, Vexlar approached Peter and Lisa. He thanked them for their discovery and for presenting it with respect rather than mockery. Peter shook his hand, a human gesture that Vexlar had learned meant friendship and agreement. They had solved a 400-year-old mystery together. Now it was time to discover what else the galaxy had been missing. The news spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Within a week, every major civilization knew about the Onion revelation. News networks ran the story constantly, showing images of the containment fields next to pictures of sliced vegetables. Some reporters treated it seriously, discussing what it meant for scientific research. Others were less kind. On Earth, the story became huge. Late-night television hosts built entire shows around it. One popular comedian did a bit where he presented common vegetables to his audience as mysterious alien artifacts, holding up a potato and describing it in serious scientific terms as an unknown tuberous creature. The audience loved it. Social media exploded with memes showing onions in research labs with captions like, "Specimen refuses to communicate," and "Day 146,000 of observation." Still no progress. The Galactic Council faced harder questions. Senator Qualley stood in the council chambers and demanded answers. How could their best scientists study a vegetable for 4 centuries without recognizing it? If they were this wrong about something so basic, what else might they be missing? His voice echoed through the hall as he listed other ongoing research projects, asking which of those might be equally flawed. Dr. Kevin Murphy, a human philosopher working with the Council's Ethics Committee, tried to provide a different perspective. He stood up and explained that the mistake made perfect sense when you thought about it. The alien scientist had no reason to know what an onion was. They had never seen Earth plants, never encountered anything like human agriculture. They had used every tool available to them and documented everything carefully. Their methods were sound. Their only limitation was experience. Lisa wrote a paper about the whole situation. She argued that this proved how important it was to have different species working together. Every civilization brought unique knowledge based on what they had experienced on their own worlds. Humans recognized onions because onions were part of human history. The Xanthari might instantly recognize something that would confuse humans for centuries. The key was cooperation and sharing knowledge across species barriers. Dr. Helen Carter, another human scientist, supported Lisa's work with her own research. She showed how galactic biology had always focused more on animals than plants. Most spacefaring species had evolved from hunters or omnivores, and their science reflected that. Plant biology had been treated as less important, studied mainly for food production rather than deep understanding. This bias had made the onion mistake almost inevitable. The paper got attention across the scientific community. Universities started creating new programs focused on plant xenobiology. The Xanthari Science Academy established an entire department dedicated to it, with Vexlar leading the effort. He had taken the revelation better than most, immediately shifting his research to understand Earth's plant life and how it compared to vegetation from other worlds. The research stations that held the onion specimens became popular destinations. Scientists from everywhere came to see the vegetables that had fooled generations of researchers. The specimens were kept as they were, floating in their containment fields, but now with proper labels explaining what they actually were. They served as teaching tools, reminders to question assumptions and stay humble in the face of the unknown. Commander Lissara was already organizing a new expedition to Kelrath Prime. The old expeditions had looked for technology, weapons, grand achievements. But if the Kelrath had cared enough to preserve onions, maybe their civilization had been different from what everyone assumed. Maybe they had been farmers, not warriors. Maybe their greatness had been in growing things, not building machines. Greg Palmer joined the expedition team as the chief archaeological consultant. He specialized in agricultural societies on Earth, studying ancient farming techniques and food culture. He brought databases full of information about Earth crops, farming tools, and how civilizations developed around agriculture. If the Kelrath had grown onions, there should be evidence of fields, irrigation, storage, all the infrastructure that farming required. The new expedition was scheduled to launch in 3 months. Public interest was intense. For the first time, humans weren't just participating in a galactic mission, they were essential to it. Their knowledge of agriculture made them uniquely qualified to understand what might be found in the Kelrath ruins. But not everyone was happy about humanity's sudden importance. Some alien factions felt embarrassed by the whole situation. They saw the human discovery as showing up the older, more established civilizations. Political tensions started building beneath the surface of scientific cooperation. Some senators began questioning whether humans should be given equal status when they had only joined the council 2 years ago. The tensions came to a head during a council session 3 weeks after the revelation. Senator Qualex proposed limiting human access to certain research projects until they had been members longer. He argued that proper protocols needed time to learn, that rushing humans into major projects was dangerous. Kevin Murphy stood to respond. He pointed out that if protocols had prevented humans from examining the eyeball creatures, the galaxy would still be studying vegetables and calling them mysterious life forms. Sometimes, he said, fresh perspectives were exactly what research needed. Experience was valuable, but so was the ability to see things without preconceptions. The debate went on for hours. Different species took different sides. Some supported the humans, grateful for the breakthrough and eager to learn more. Others sided with Qualis, worried that traditional scientific hierarchies were being disrupted too quickly. In the end, the council voted to allow human participation in the Kelrath expedition without restrictions. The vote was close, showing how divided opinion had become. But it was enough. The mission would proceed as planned, with humans playing key roles in the research. Back on Station Epsilon, Vexlar was training a mixed team of humans and aliens in plant biology. He had students from 6 different species, all learning together about how to identify and study vegetation. The classes were popular, filled with scientists eager to make sure they never made the same kind of mistake again. Peter and Lisa continued their work, now co-directing a new program called the Agricultural Heritage Project. The goal was to study plant life from across the galaxy, building a comprehensive database that any species could access. They hoped to prevent future misunderstandings and maybe discover useful crops that could be shared between civilizations. Susan Hayes, a botanist from Earth, joined their team. She brought expertise in seed preservation and plant genetics. Together, they began planning how to handle whatever plant specimens might be found on Kelrath Prime. If there were more preserved foods in those ruins, they needed to be ready to identify and possibly cultivate them. The onion specimens themselves became symbols of cooperation between humans and aliens. Museums requested samples for display. Educational institutions used them as examples in classes about scientific method and the importance of questioning assumptions. What had been embarrassing became educational, but the biggest change was in how scientists approached their work. Across the galaxy, researchers started bringing in consultants from different fields and different species before making conclusions about unknown specimens. The lesson of the onions that expertise from unexpected places could solve persistent mysteries had been learned. 3 months after Peter and Lisa's revelation, the expedition ship prepared for launch. The crew was ready, the equipment was loaded, and everyone knew their roles. They were heading to Kelrath Prime not to find advanced technology or mysterious creatures, but to understand a civilization through its gardens and kitchens. As the ship pulled away from the station, millions of beings across the galaxy watched the broadcast. This wasn't just another research mission. This was the beginning of a new way of doing science, one that valued diversity of knowledge as much as depth of expertise. And it had all started because 2 humans had recognized a vegetable. The expedition ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kelrath system. Through the viewports, Kelrath Prime appeared as a blue-green sphere marked with geometric patterns visible even from space. Greg Palmer stood on the bridge next to Commander Lisara, both of them studying the preliminary scans that were coming in. The planet looked abandoned, but not dead. Vegetation had grown wild across much of the surface, but the old patterns were still there. Massive fields laid out in careful grids, irrigation channels cutting across continents, the bones of an agricultural civilization waiting to tell its story. Previous expeditions had focused on the northern continent where the stasis facility stood. Greg suggested they start elsewhere, in the southern hemisphere where the scans showed the largest concentration of what looked like farming structures. Commander Lisara agreed and ordered the ship to adjust course. Dr. Susan Hayes worked at a science station alongside Vexlar, analyzing atmospheric data and soil samples collected by remote probes. The planet's environment had changed over the millennia, but the basic chemistry looked promising. The air was breathable without suits, the temperature comfortable, and the soil showed signs of being deliberately enriched with nutrients long ago. The landing team touched down near what Greg identified as a central processing facility. The buildings were different from the temples in the north, more functional and less decorative. They spread out in organized clusters connected by wide pathways that would have allowed easy transport of harvested crops. Peter was among the first to enter the main building. Inside, he found rows of equipment lining the walls. The tools were sized for beings with 4 arms instead of 2, but their purposes were immediately recognizable to anyone who knew farming. There were implements for breaking up soil, devices for planting seeds in neat rows, and what looked like harvesting machines designed to gather crops efficiently. Lisa called out from a side chamber. She had found the storage areas. Unlike the sophisticated stasis chambers in the north, these were simpler structures meant for keeping food fresh for months, rather than millennia. Inside were the dried remains of dozens of plant species, their forms preserved by the dry atmosphere even without active technology. Susan carefully extracted samples, her excitement growing with each new specimen. She recognized some features that suggested relation to Earth plants while others were completely alien. The Kelrath had clearly developed their own unique agricultural ecosystem, possibly over thousands of years of selective breeding and cultivation. Over the next 2 weeks, the team explored the farming complex thoroughly. They found living quarters for workers, communal dining areas, and what appeared to be educational facilities where farming techniques might have been taught. The picture that emerged was of a society that had valued agriculture, not just as food production but as a central part of their culture. Greg made his biggest discovery in a building that sat at the center of the complex. It was filled with what he recognized as records, thousands of documents stored in sealed containers that had protected them from decay. The Kelrath writing system had been partially translated years ago, mainly from religious texts found in the northern temples. These documents were different, filled with charts, numbers, and technical terminology. He spent days working through the records with the help of translation software and Zenthari linguists. What he found was extraordinary. The Kelrath had kept detailed logs of everything: crop rotations, harvest yields, soil quality measurements, weather patterns, pest management techniques. This wasn't just farming. It was agricultural science at a level that impressed even modern researchers. The records told a story that previous expeditions had completely missed. The Kelrath hadn't been a military power or a technological empire. They had been master gardeners who had transformed their entire planet into a carefully managed ecosystem. Every field, every crop, every planting had been part of an intricate system designed to sustain billions of people in balance with their environment. Peter found something that changed everything. Beneath the central building was another level, sealed and hidden. When they opened it, they discovered a laboratory far more advanced than the farming equipment above. This was where Kelrath scientists had worked on their crops, studying genetics and breeding new varieties. The lab equipment was familiar to Peter from his own research. There were devices for analyzing plant DNA, equipment for crossbreeding different species, and computers that still held data about genetic modification programs. The Kelrath had been improving their crops through science, creating plants that grew better, resisted diseases, and provided more nutrition. But there was something else in the lab, evidence of a crisis. The computers held detailed studies of a disease that had attacked their crops. The Kelrath scientists had called it the Pale Death, a blight that spread through their fields faster than they could contain it. The record showed their desperate attempts to engineer resistance, to find any way to save their plants. Susan found the connection to the northern stasis facility. When the Kelrath realized they couldn't stop the blight, they had shifted strategies. They preserved everything they could: seeds, bulbs, genetic samples, storing them in the most advanced containment systems they could build. The onions had been part of this effort, a crop that had fed the Kelrath civilization for thousands of years, being saved for a future that might never come. Commander Lissara stood in the laboratory, reading through the final entries in the research logs. The last Kelrath scientist to work here had written a message, hoping that whoever found this place would understand what they had tried to do. They had failed to save their crops in time, and without food, their civilization had collapsed. But they hadn't given up completely. The records indicated that evacuation ships had been prepared, carrying seeds and people to other worlds. The Kelrath who stayed behind had preserved everything they could, hoping that their knowledge wouldn't be lost forever. Greg found references to the northern facility in the agricultural records. It had been built as an archive, a place to store the genetic heritage of their entire agricultural system. The onions were there along with thousands of other species, each one carefully preserved in stasis. It wasn't just a few random vegetables, it was a comprehensive seed bank designed to survive millennia. The revelation transformed the expedition's understanding of the Kelrath. They hadn't been primitive farmers. They had been sophisticated agricultural engineers who had built an entire civilization around growing things. Their technology had been focused not on weapons or conquest, but on understanding and nurturing plant life. Susan brought news that made everyone realize the true scale of what they had found. The seed vault in the north contained viable specimens from over 2,000 plant species. With proper care and the knowledge contained in the agricultural records, many of those plants could be grown again. The Kelrath legacy wasn't dead, it had just been sleeping. The team worked around the clock to document and preserve what they found. This was no longer just about understanding a mystery. They had discovered the accumulated agricultural knowledge of an entire advanced civilization, information that could potentially benefit every species in the galaxy. Peter looked at the preserved seeds under a microscope, marveling at how something so small could carry so much history. Each seed represented generations of Kelrath farmers selecting the best plants, improving them year after year. Each one was a testament to patience and care spanning centuries. The expedition had been planned for 3 months, but Commander Lysara extended it to 6. There was too much to learn, too much to preserve. Other ships arrived to help with the work, bringing more scientists and better equipment. The farming complex became a bustling research center, alive again after millennia of silence. As Greg walked through the restored pathways between buildings, he thought about the Kelrath who had worked here. They had faced the end of their world and had chosen to preserve life rather than wealth or power. They had saved seeds instead of gold, knowledge instead of weapons. In their final days, they had tried to give the future a gift. And now, thousands of years later, that gift was finally being opened. 6 months after the expedition's return, Station Epsilon looked completely different. The facility that had once been dedicated to studying mysterious eyeball creatures was now the galaxy's center for agricultural research. The onions still floated in their containment fields, but now they had proper labels identifying them as Allium kelrathensis, the first plant species formally cataloged from the Kelrath homeworld. Peter and Lisa ran the Agricultural Heritage Project together, coordinating teams of scientists from 40 different species. Their goal was to study and understand the thousands of plant varieties recovered from Kelrath Prime. Susan had successfully grown seeds from over 200 species, each one cultivated in carefully recreated Kelrath soil conditions in the station's expanded greenhouse facilities. The response from the galactic community had exceeded everyone's hopes. Instead of being embarrassed by the onion incident, most civilizations embraced it as a chance to learn something new. The Xanthari Science Academy created entire new departments focused on plant biology, with Vexillar leading the effort. 3 Valorian research ships had been redirected to search for other abandoned agricultural worlds that might hold similar treasures. On Earth, the original onion specimen was displayed in the Smithsonian Museum, with a plaque explaining how it had bridged human and alien understanding. Children across dozens of worlds learned about it in school, studying how different perspectives could solve problems that seemed impossible. But the real transformation was happening on Kelrath Prime itself. Greg Palmer had proposed an ambitious plan to restore the planet as a living memorial to the Kelrath civilization. Instead of just preserving ruins, they would rebuild the gardens and grow the ancient crops using techniques described in the recovered records. The Galactic Council had voted unanimously to support the project. Funding poured in from governments, universities, and private organizations across known space. Volunteers from hundreds of species signed up to participate in what was being called the greatest agricultural restoration in galactic history. Dr. Alan Brooks led the terraforming team. He was an expert in restoration ecology from Earth, with decades of experience bringing damaged environments back to life. Working with Kelrath records and modern technology, his team began the careful process of returning the soil to its ancient composition. The blight that had destroyed the Kelrath crops was long extinct, its biological traces still present in samples but no longer active or dangerous. The first planting ceremony drew representatives from every council species. Cameras broadcast the event across the galaxy as Commander Lysara knelt in prepared soil and placed Kelrath onion bulbs into the ground, following procedures that Greg had translated from farming manuals thousands of years old. It was a symbolic moment, the beginning of bringing an entire civilization's legacy back to life. As weeks passed and the first plants began to grow, something unexpected happened. The Kelrath crops proved remarkably adaptable to different planetary conditions. Several species could grow in environments that would have killed native plants, making them valuable for colony worlds struggling to establish agriculture. 3 species in particular showed promise as supplemental food sources for spacefaring populations. Lisa published her comprehensive study on the Kelrath agricultural system 6 months after the first planting. She demonstrated how the Kelrath had created an interconnected ecosystem where each plant species supported the others. Some added nitrogen to the soil, others provided shade for more delicate crops, and still others attracted beneficial insects that pollinated or protected the plants. It was biological engineering at a level that modern science was only beginning to understand. Universities across the galaxy added her work to their core curriculum. Students studied the Kelrath methods alongside their own species' agricultural history, learning how different approaches to farming could achieve similar goals through different paths. Peter focused on practical applications. Working with nutritionists from various species, he identified which Kelrath crops could safely supplement different alien diets. The onions themselves turned out to be useful for certain species' metabolisms, providing nutrients that were hard to obtain in space. Humans, of course, still just put them in salads. The cultural impact reached beyond science. Artists created installations in the growing Kelrath gardens, combining ancient agricultural patterns with modern aesthetic sensibilities. Musicians composed pieces meant to be performed among the crops, finding inspiration in the rhythm of growth and harvest. Philosophers wrote extensively about a civilization that had chosen to preserve life even as their own society crumbled. On the first anniversary of the revelation, Station Epsilon hosted a celebration. Scientists who had spent careers studying the eyeball creatures stood alongside the humans who had identified them. There was laughter, some good-natured jokes about vegetables in laboratories, and genuine appreciation for how far everyone had come. Vexlar gave a speech that was broadcast throughout Council space. He talked about the importance of humility in science, about being willing to admit mistakes, and about the value that every species brought to the collective pursuit of knowledge. He thanked the humans not just for solving the mystery, but for doing so with grace and helping build something greater from the discovery. The Kelrath gardens on the restored planet grew steadily. Within a year, entire fields bloomed with crops that hadn't been seen for millennia. Workers from dozens of species moved among the plants, learning the ancient techniques and adapting them to modern needs. The planet that had been silent and empty was alive again with activity and purpose. Greg stood in one of those fields as the sun set, painting the sky in colors the Kelrath must have known. Around him, crops grew in neat rows following patterns laid out by farmers who had died thousands of years ago. But the patterns weren't empty anymore. They were being carried forward by new hands, new minds, new species that the Kelrath could never have imagined. Susan approached with exciting news. The Kelrath onions were ready for their first harvest. The bulbs had grown perfectly, their layers forming exactly as documented in the ancient stasis chambers. She asked if Greg wanted to harvest the first one himself. He knelt in the rich soil, feeling the weight of history in the moment. His hands closed around the green stalks growing from the bulb, and he pulled gently. The onion came free from the earth, perfect and round, its papery skin golden in the fading light. It looked exactly like the specimens that had puzzled the galaxy for 400 years. Somewhere above, in laboratories and greenhouses across known space, other Kelrath plants were thriving. The civilization that had vanished was being remembered not through monuments or museums alone, but through living gardens that fed people and brought different species together in shared purpose. The Kelrath had built their legacy not in stone or metal, but in seeds. They had believed that life was worth preserving, that the knowledge of how to grow food was sacred, that future generations deserved the gift of their accumulated wisdom. They had been right to believe it. Research continued at Station Epsilon and on Kelrath Prime. New species were being identified from the seed vault, each one adding to the understanding of Kelrath agriculture. Some turned out to be medicinal plants, others were beautiful flowering species, and some were simply good vegetables that different species enjoyed eating. The onions became a symbol of cooperation between humans and aliens. They represented the importance of diverse perspectives, the value of questioning assumptions, and the rewards of working together across species boundaries. What had started as an embarrassing mistake had transformed into one of the greatest collaborative achievements in galactic history. Peter and Lisa continued their work, now recognized as leading experts in agricultural xenobiology. They trained new researchers, published papers, and helped coordinate restoration projects on other abandoned agricultural worlds that had been discovered. The field they had helped create was growing rapidly, attracting talented minds from across the galaxy. On Earth, farmers began growing Kelrath onions alongside traditional varieties. The taste was slightly different, but good enough that some restaurants featured them as specialty items. It was strange to think that vegetables from an extinct alien civilization were being served in human kitchens, but it felt right somehow. Food had always been meant to be shared. Greg remained on Kelrath Prime, overseeing the ongoing restoration work. He had found his calling in bringing the dead planet back to life. Every day brought new discoveries as more of the agricultural complex was excavated and understood. He liked to imagine the Kelrath farmers who had worked these same fields, hoping they would be pleased to see their gardens thriving again. The galaxy had changed in the year since two humans recognized a vegetable. Scientific research had become more collaborative, more willing to seek expertise from unexpected places. Cultural exchanges focused not just on technology and art, but on practical knowledge like farming and cooking. Species that had been strangers learned to work together toward common goals, and it had all started because Peter and Lisa had grown up eating onions. As the second year of restoration began, the Kelrath gardens covered hundreds of square kilometers. Plans were being made to